Hey, I'm Jonas. For those who haven't met me yet, for the last year, I've been building up a global Axel Springer developer community. The community that's building or meeting here today, that's what I'm trying to connect together with my colleague Anna. But I'm also a front-end developer by trade. And today I want to talk to you about something that I've recently discovered. If you like, you can connect with me on LinkedIn and also just write me an email, whatever. And if you have any questions, just leave them in the chat. I'll see them. And then after the talk, I'll try and answer them. Also, I'll try and sort of get through my material here on time, just so that we can give you a quick update about the global Axel Springer developer community. And Daniel and Muddy already mentioned a few things, how you can stay connected and how you can stay in the loop. I'll tell you more about that after this talk. But first, let's dive into this. So as I said, I'm a front-end developer, and I've recently discovered something very exciting that I want to share with you today. It's a simple rule that guarantees clean UI code. And the best part is that you can actually start implementing that today. So I structured this talk in like 4 different chapters. First, I'll talk to you about component-driven development. You might have heard about this philosophy. And next up, we're going to see a tool, an open source tool that's been very popular in the last few years that helps you to build your UIs in a component-driven way, and that's Storybook. And then we sort of lay the foundation so that I can show you the rule that I stumbled upon, which I'm using myself to work on a side project right now that has some really, really nice clean code. And lastly, I also want to show you how this is not only good for you as a developer, but for the whole team. All right, let's dive in. So first of all, let's talk about component-driven development. It's sort of an approach to building UIs where you break it down into 4 different layers. At the very bottom layer, like the most granular level, is components. So that will be your buttons, your inputs, your user avatars, maybe your tooltips, all these little tiny components that you use all throughout your interface. The idea is that you then take these components and build them into what I call fragments. So things like a header toolbar, or maybe a list of things. In this second step, you essentially take your basic components, sometimes people also call this atomic components, and you combine them into something that's more combined, essentially. You compose them into these fragments that make up part of your UI. The next layer is pages. And what's interesting here is that what they're saying down here, you want to build pages just in the way that you build the components of the fragments. So you just combine visual components here. And then what component-driven design or development really sort of drove home for me is that only after you assembled your pages do you then add your business logic, your network requests, your database integration, all of that good stuff. Only then you add that on top. So this got me thinking, and the core idea that I took from this is, what if we actually assemble pages like they suggest here? So what they say is that you assemble pages from other visual components, and you go ahead and you mock the data, and you simulate all the things that are happening in that page. And that's really interesting that they would sort of suggest that, because typically, in my experience, pages are the most messy. That's sort of where all the visual stuff and all the state stuff is sort of really scrambled together. And mostly they are huge components, which like super, super inconsistent styles of building them. In my experience, often logic and visuals are then tested together. So, I mean, raise your mental hand if that's sort of been a situation that you had to face quite a bit, where you would see a test where you mock Firestore or maybe a network request, and you test that network request by essentially simulating a click in a UI. So essentially, you're sort of testing both things at the same time. That makes testing really complicated. And the big old state manager wars of a few years ago, Redux versus MobX versus all these other things, sharing state can really get complicated most of the time in the typical setups that I saw so far. So the big idea that I came away with here is, what if we treat our pages as purely visual components too? And that's sort of the core idea that I want to talk to you about today. I mean, think about it. You wouldn't have any mocks in your test. You would just have props and event handlers. It will be way easier to make it responsive because all of a sudden you're really just focusing on turning this visual into that visual, sort of this big visual on a big screen into like this small mobile version. And also it's an amazing separation of concerns. If you actually treat your pages as visual components, all of a sudden you do really have like the parallel development of the business logic and the visuals, but it's separated because it's only getting sort of combined in the end. I also sort of saw that maybe the drawback is that you need to invest more work into getting the abstractions just right. But yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of the core of like good quality software to get and build good abstractions. All right, great speech cap. How do we use this now? How do we implement this? Well, this brings me to my second point, Storybook. Now, for those of you who have never seen Storybook before, as you can see by the GitHub stars, it's a hugely, immensely popular framework on GitHub. It's being installed roughly 10 million times every week. That's what their website says. And you can kind of think about it as a gallery for your visual components. So if we just take a look at this video that's available on the website, what you can see over here on the left, first of all, they make it really easy to sort of group your components. And then what you can see here is sort of just folders basically filled with components. And those blue things here, those are your individual components, while these green parts down here are different states. And what we can see down here is that all of these props that are available for your components, you can actually set them in this editor down here, and then the component will be rendered live with these changes that you make. And these over here are essentially just setting different props. So all of a sudden, this is probably the different states that your designer might define, or in this case, what you can see here as well, this is one of the edge cases, right? Where you have a chart, but no data. And so like that, it's really, easy to think about all these different use cases that you want to have in your visual components, and then also make sure that it all looks correctly. Now, the point that you have to understand about Storybook is that everything that you see in Storybook can only rely on props and event handlers. So you have no network requests, you have no state managers, you have some business logic if you decide to do that. So if you think about a form, for example, that might sort of independently validate the inputs and then only interact with the network once the user hits submit. So yeah, a little bit of business logic might be in there, but it's all just purely visual components. And the rule of thumb that I found to be true is that if it's in Storybook, it's very easy to test. Now, the great news here. Let's see, next slide, please. All right, the great news here is that essentially, you know, if you, here we go. All right. The good news is that installing Storybook is really, simple. So if you have an existing project with Create React App, Vue CLI or Ember CLI, and many more, those are just the core things that they support. All you have to type into your console is npx sb init, and it'll take care of it automatically. Then once that's run through, all you have to do is go yarn Storybook or npm run Storybook, and then a new page opens up with your whole Storybook. And the sort of temptation, of course, is to now build everything completely new from the ground up, right? But the good news here as well is that it's not only easy to install, but it's also a tool that you can gradually adopt. So you don't have to just rebuild everything. You can just follow this good old Scouts rule to leave the campsite better than you found it. So you can just build your Storybook gradually, pulling components out of your projects while you work on them, and then just slowly building up this visual language. Nobody said that you have to rebuild your entire UI just because you start using a new tool. All right, now to make this a little more palpable, what I want to do is actually show you a quick demo of my personal project that I'm working on right now. And what I did, and when I had this already, I opened up my Storybook on the side. So I'll go to that in a second. What we'll see here is buttons, list item, and then the fragment part where I take these list items and combine them into a list. And then we're also going to see the page. And most importantly, in my mind, how you can use Storybook to actually make sure that your responsive designs are all implemented correctly. All right. So this is Storybook, and as I said, like this setup is super easy and simple to get to. And what you can see here, I already went ahead and grouped my visual library into components, and then fragments, and then pages. And what we can see here with the button, if you ever built a button before as a front developer, all of a sudden there's all these edge cases, right? So it's really interesting, like just how many states a button can have. And building it in isolation like that gives you the great opportunity to actually build really cute details into it. So take a look at this button. It actually shakes if the asynchronous network request or asynchronous event handler throws an error. But what you also saw here is that, I figured if it sort of has this red border because it was an error, like how can the user reset it? Well, they can't really. So that's why I'm making sure that the border disappears. And keep that in mind. That's really the level of detail that you can actually get down to if you like, if you start building your visual components and just concentrate on the visuals. Next up, I want to show you this list item. So I'm building a small notes app that lets you also create tasks. And the beauty of this notes app is that you can actually put your tasks into your Google Calendar and also put your notes into your Google Calendar. That's sort of the thing that I'm working on right now. So obviously, I need a way for people to click on their notes. And this is just one row in like a list of notes, right? Now let's take a look at the chances here or the features that Storybook gives me. So if I sort of set it up right, then I can actually go ahead and test this out. Headline of a note, blah, blah, blah. Last edited yesterday, for example, but actually I don't need that because I have that over here. And as you can see, different control types are supported. So what's really cool is that this date picker is built in. I didn't have to build this. And so if I want to test out whether this relative date display worked correctly, I can just go ahead and select something here. And actually, I never tried this before, but let me just go into the future. I have no idea what will happen. All right, in 9 months, perfect. So you can see that it's very fast to test out these different states of my component and make sure that it looks good, even if I enter different data. And we can see down here that I also have this selected state set up, and the only difference is that this prop was already set to true. So these are the components. Let's take a look at what fragments look like. So over here, we have this notes list. And what's interesting is that these are the components that we saw before, only combined. And now I have different props here. I can, for example, set another value that's sort of selected. And what's also really interesting, the event handlers are also taken care of. In this case, you can see by this actions pane down here that an event handler was called, and they will even show you the parameters with which it was called. So you can really sort of discover and test your whole component library here. Of course, it's not replacing testing itself, but as a human being interacting with this stuff, that's how you can test it out and sort of play around and make sure it feels good. Now let's go to the third step. And this is really where it blew my mind. And that's this page view. So you can see here that now I assembled all of these fragments into this page. And what's really cool is that Storybook actually lets us also switch to the mobile view, for example. They have different sort of canvases. And that's exactly where you can find out stuff like that. Like, oh, this spacing doesn't really work. So let's fix that. You can see here different mobile handsets. And this also makes it really easy for you to test your breakpoints. And that's the beauty of Storybook. It makes it really, really easy for you to build high quality component-based UIs. So this brings me to this #1 rule that I think you should all adopt. And that's, let's see, my slide is loading here. Come on. All right. The one rule that I found to guarantee clean UI code is that everything that the user sees must be in your Storybook. I think if you follow this rule, and yes, you also include the pages, then you really get to a place where your UI is super, super clean and simple. And I have to speed up this presentation just a little bit so I can also give you an update on the tech community. So let me just say, usually what I see in Storybooks is that people kind of include the components and maybe the fragments. Component-driven design, all it does, or component-driven development, is actually sort of asking you or urging you to also include your pages in that. And if I can sort of leave you with just one thing, the purpose of this whole presentation is actually to convince you to start doing this, to also include your pages in this whole setup. So go ahead, include all the visual things. And I think you will all be better developers for it and also a lot happier as a team. And that's sort of the last point that I want to touch on. This is not only good for you as a developer, this is also good for the whole team. And team assuming that you work as a cross-functional team, actually. Benefit number one, this rule is incredibly easy to commit to. How many discussions did you have over, do we use functional styles or class styles? Do we use this linter rule or that linter rule? Well, with this rule, it's so simple. It's so easy for everybody to check that it's really easy to commit to. Once you commit as a team, that's it. Every ticket that you build in the future, every new release of your website, it needs to be visible in Storybook, and then this rule is followed. And if it's not, then something is missing, and you should probably go in there and fix that. Rule number two, or the benefit number two of this very simple rule is that it's the same visual language throughout your whole team. This really enables your designers, for example, to really think in reusable components, making sure that they actually build designs that are really well supported by the existing visual language. The same is true for product owners. I mean, raise your mental hand if you had product owners before that had this really cool idea and they're sure it doesn't take very long. Well, in this case, what you can do is, hey, dear product owner, here's a static build of Storybook. By the way, you can build a static version and host Storybook on your development servers. And what this gives you is really the chance to point them to it and be like, hey, this component up there, that's not supported, but here's some other components that are similar. Maybe pick one of those and think about how we can implement the use case that you're thinking of with these existing components. The next aspect is that you're really free to focus on the details again. Think about it. What you just saw, I think, kind of proves the point. By just focusing on the visuals and not thinking about the business logic, you can really get the details right. And you can actually make sure that it looks good on all different kinds of handheld devices, for example. I think this is really important. And in my mind, sort of, if the details are right of anything that you build, then the whole experience is amazing. Obviously, the fundamentals have to be there, but if you then can also get the details right, boy, that's really an exciting and pleasant experience. Loading my next slide. There we go. Benefit number 4, and this is sort of an optional thing, bring your own style. A friend of mine, when I talked or told him about this presentation, he was like, you know what? It's kind of like these racing tracks. Everybody has their same lines. Everybody has the same shot of the starting gun. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what people like to wear when they run. It doesn't even matter if they want to run barefoot, I guess, or with shoes. And the same applies here. This rule is so simple that in theory, you don't have to do any discussions anymore about, do we use CSS in JavaScript, or is it more of a separate CSS file? Do we use functional components or class-based components? Well, maybe it doesn't really matter that much, because at the end of the day, if it's in Storybook, it's easy to test, it's easy to reuse, and it's easy to sort of compose with other components. So maybe this even frees you up to bring your own style as individual developers. Another really important point is that this makes it really easy for people to onboard. If you have junior developers in the team, and every team has junior developers, there's always that one person that has only started working with React 2 years ago, and that's perfectly fine. But exactly for those kind of situations, or maybe if you have a new person coming into the team or from another team, whatever it may be, it's super, super easy because that person can actually go in and kind of fiddle around with these components and really get a feel for it. And also because it's all separated, you know, the visual language and then the business logic, at the end of the day, they can actually build new visuals much easier because it's already very cleanly separated, and they don't run the risk of breaking anything in terms of network by just building visuals first. And the last and definitely not least benefit here, it's so easy to test. Your tests become probably almost trivial, and that's a good thing. By just testing or by building components in a way that they only rely on the props and give feedback through their event handlers, this becomes so easy to test and just get right. So overall, you make your life a lot easier through that, I think. And that's essentially all that I wanted to know today. I discovered a really simple rule that I think guarantees really clean UI code. And that is that everything that user sees must be in Storybook. And you can start today. Just go to your terminal, type npx sb init, and off you go. Thank you so much.